and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 32, The Great Seljuk Empire, the State. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. We're going to start today by covering the state. Next time, we're going to discuss the military, followed by the economy, religion, and finally, culture. The goal of these episodes is really to flesh out and explain what the empire was actually like. I realized while I was doing the narrative episodes that there was just too much detail that would completely slow down the narrative, so I just couldn't include it. But that detail is also absolutely critical to understanding the Great Seljuk Empire and also to understanding the legacy of the Great Seljuks. And that legacy is going to be inherited by the successor state in Anatolia when we pick back up with the narrative, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. So like I said, today we're going to start with the state, which is something we've actually spent a decent amount of time discussing already. Now, if you think back to the very beginning of our narrative episodes on the Seljuks, you'll remember that the Seljuks started off as a band of Turkish refugees fleeing south into Khorasan. They therefore didn't really have any formal state structures, just the traditional Turkish clan and tribal political systems of the steppe world. And if you think back to the last episodes, you'll recall that the golden age of the empire ended with a Persian Grand Vizier as the most powerful person in the state. That is quite a transformation. Moving from traditional Turkish clans to a state so sophisticated that not only does it have a non-Turkish Grand Vizier, but that Grand Vizier is in fact the real master of the state. So in many ways, this episode is going to be laying out the process by which this state was built. And it will, in a sense, really continue and flesh out the story that we've seen since the rise of Tuhrul. But we should never forget that while a great state was built, the tribes remained. And even unto the end of the dynasty in Anatolia, the tribes will be an important part of the state. This is above all important to remember because of the nature of our sources. What has come down to us are the writings of the literate, sedentary authors, people often called khutab, the scribes. These people came from the existing Perso-Islamic system, and as such, they naturally disdained the Turkish elements in the state. Their writings therefore try to minimize the importance of the Turks. This means that we need to take them with a grain of salt and remember that these traditional Turkish elements were of course a critical part of the empire. In a sense, the state was built on an awkward and extremely tense alliance between the Perso-Islamic bureaucrats and the wild Turkmen tribes. And only the former left us their side of the story. But that said, the importance of the Turkmen to the regime was such that even the bureaucrats couldn't really deny it. And evidence of this slips through the cracks in the writings that they have left to us. In his Siyasetname, Nizam-ul-Mulk says the following: "When the sublime Padishah moves with his retinue, it is extremely necessary to fulfill the responsibility to prepare pasturage and forage in each place they will stay. Unless this is done, the provision of the animals among the flocks will fall unacceptably." Now the Siyasetname is designed to be an instruction manual to princes and viziers, and it is telling that even Nizam-ul-Mulk, who remember, viscerally hated the Turkmen traditions, warns his readers of the need to provide the tribes with pasturage. In a sense, that the sublime Padishah also fulfilled the obligations of a steppe Khan. And Nizam-ul-Mulk went even further, writing, "Whatever discomfort may come from it, the Turkmen have a long-standing claim on this dynasty on account of their numbers, and because at its beginning they suffered much for it and served it well, and they are also attached to it by blood. It is very, very telling that even this arch-modernizer, this master chef, the cooker of the barbarians, was forced to admit that. And we have seen this throughout the narrative. Always, the Sultan was functioning in a dual role. He was both the Sultan, the Padishah, in the Perso-Islamic political tradition, and he was a steppe warlord in the traditional steppe context. And as we have seen, the tension between these twin roles really drove much of Seljuk history. Now, like I said, when the state started out, it was really a classic Turkish tribal confederation, a grouping of tribes and clans that coalesced around the Seljuk dynasty. As a traditional steppe confederation, the Seljuks were therefore initially driven by the concerns of the tribes. The tribes were above all concerned with securing adequate pasturage and with tribute, in other words, resource extraction. They did not care at all about actually administering lands that they conquered. But this changed, of course. It started off with Seljuk leaders demanding the right to collect taxes from given areas from the Ghaznavid sultans, in essence, iktafifs. But then slowly, the Seljuk elites became interested in administering the lands that they had these tax rights over, in essence, to become actual lords of Khorasan. Their ambitions expanded after the Battle of Dandan Khan, the collapse of the Ghaznavids, and the stunning successes of Tukhrul, and as they became more and more acculturated to the Islamic world that they now found themselves the masters of. So taking a step back and looking at the big picture, as we discussed in the narrative, it was under the reign of Tukhrul that the basic building blocks of a Persian-style state were put in place. They were adopted by the Seljuk court from the Karakhanate models and the state structures already in existence in Iran that the Seljuks encountered in their conquests. Because of the nature of Tukhrul's conquests, the way that he negotiated his way into power, these state structures basically slotted in atop the existing local state structures in the lands that Tukhrul conquered. But as Tukhrul's reign continued, the structures of the central Seljuk state eventually came to push down through the pre-existing local state structures. This, of course, continued during Alp Arslan's reign and reached its apogee during Al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. But what were these structures of the central state? What exactly had been adopted from the sedentary Perso-Islamic civilization? And how did this relate to the continuing Turkish tribal structures? At the very center of the state was the Seljuk Dynasty itself. As with almost all steppe confederations, the Seljuk state started off as a grouping of tribes coalescing and indeed forming around this dynasty. And the Seljuk dynasty remained critical to the state throughout its reign. This was the Seljuk Empire. This is in fact a pattern of rule that we've seen before on the steppe. Think about how the first and second khanates were formed around the Ashina clan. A dynasty was the core around which Turkish states often formed, and the state that the dynasty built was in a sense seen as being the collective property of the ruling clan as a whole. The concept of clan sovereignty, as we have called it. And this would remain the core of the state even as it evolved. However much it would change and cook, and however sophisticated it became, the Seljuk Empire remained a Turkish state, and retained this Turkish concept of clan sovereignty. Crucially, as we have discussed at length in the narrative, this included the Turkish rules of succession, that any member of the ruling clan had a claim, and the concept that the state was essentially divisible or subdivisible among the princes of the ruling house. Think of the division of the state into east and west between Tukhrul and Shahri, which was a division along the traditional east-west, left-right scheme of Turkish states, which went back centuries. Or think about later in the narrative, how the line of Kavurt got to rule in Kirman, the line of Kutalmish in Anatolia, and even how Tutush and his descendants ruled in Syria, how they would be allowed to stay in power even after a revolt. All of this was tied to the concept of clan sovereignty. Now, as we discussed in the narrative, the Seljuk dynasty were essentially nobodies. They were just nobodies who then happened to conquer the world. They did not have a link back to the Ashina clan, the original ruling clan of the Göktürk Khanate, which could be claimed by the former ruling clan of the Khazar Khanate and even the rulers of the Karakhanids. Though interestingly, there do seem to have been some attempts made by the Seljuk dynasty to tie itself to the Ashina. A contemporaneous Syrian chronicler relates that the Seljuks were led to the west by a wolf, a curious detail that mirrors the Ergenekon legend, and likely is a surviving Turkish oral tradition. But despite this, the humble and obscure origins of the dynasty meant that they would never really be the equals of the Karakhanids in the steppe political tradition, which meant that playing Shah and working within the Islamic political tradition was in a sense a way to leapfrog their social betters. So the low status of the Seljuk dynasty likely contributed to the cooking of the state. Now, as the state became more cooked, the formal structures of the Seljuk state really grew out of the court, out of the household of the sultan in a sense. And this makes sense. This is in fact the same process we see elsewhere in the world, in medieval Europe, in earlier Islamic states, and crucially in earlier Turkish states. Think back to our earliest episodes on the Göktürk and the nature of steppe states, how steppe states develop around a ruler recognized by the neighboring sedentary state. A ruler whose purpose is to mediate the relationship with that sedentary civilization. That was the nature of the ruler's role in the world that the Seljuks came from, and they took that notion with them when they moved into the sedentary world itself. But as they moved into this sedentary world, they learned from it. Under Tughral, a Perso-Islamic style court became grafted onto the traditional Turkish model. This was indeed part of how the Sultan fulfilled his role as a steppe warlord, how he mediated the relationship with the settled world by adopting the established court forms and working within the established political tradition. In essence, by playing Shah. This meant adopting the long-established Perso-Islamic ceremonies and court rituals, essentially a highly formalized court protocol. Now, our authors, of course, always play up how Persian the state was, but even they admit that this grafting process was not entirely successful. A Persian contemporary writes of the court protocol under the Seljuks. The Seljuk sultans were nomads, ignorant of the conduct of affairs and the high achievements of kings, and most of these royal customs became obsolete in their time, and many essentials of dominion fell into disuse. In many ways, it seems like the Seljuk sultans remained steppe warlords playing Shah. The language of the court remained Turkish, and the Turkish nobility and aristocracy remained absolutely central. The state at heart continued to be a Turkish state in many ways, and we're going to see this in more detail next episode when we discuss the army. Nevertheless, as the state became established, as it cooked and became more Persian, surrounding the Sultan there came to be a large body of courtiers called khas. Among the khas, a rough division between civil and military officials seems to have been kept. This division between men of the sword, usually Turkish military men, and men of the pen, typically Persians or Arab bureaucrats, was clearly the ideal. However, typical for the messy Seljuk state, this division was in practice actually somewhat blurry. Civil officials could command troops, and military officials could exercise political control, and there could be a great deal of overlap. These civilian officials among the khas were the traditional courtiers of the Perso-Islamic system, the people who would have served a shah or a caliph or an emir in prior eras. And they existed alongside the traditional Turkish elite, the Turkish nobles and chieftains and clan leaders, the people who had already been there. And as the state expanded, it took from the settled world. The court also began to employ a large body of bureaucrats to actually administer its growing empire. These bureaucrats, the Khutab, were mostly educated Persians and Arabs, though there were Kurds and even literate Turks among their ranks. They staffed the rapidly expanding Seljuk bureaucracy. Now at the top of this bureaucracy was the Grand Vizier. The most powerful Grand Vizier in Seljuk history was of course Nizam ul-Mulk, under whose role the vizierate was said to be above the sultanate. But even before and after his reign, the office was extremely powerful. The Grand Vizier would be responsible for the overall direction of the state's bureaucracy, which at least under Nizam ul-Mulk included both civil and military officials. However, we should not imagine that the responsibilities of this office were as defined as those in our present-day highly formalized states. The Grand Vizier was not like a modern prime minister with a set remit of his authority. Instead, he was merely the most powerful official in a web of powerful officials at court, and he could have rivals. Even the immensely powerful Nizam ul-Mulk had a hated rival in the bureaucracy, Taj ul-Mulk, and it is telling that he did not have the power to sack him or kill him. Another powerful office was the Mustafi, something analogous to a treasurer or finance minister. The Mustafi would be responsible for both the accounting of the state's treasury, but also managing the taxation and resource extraction parts of the state's apparatus. While the Seljuk state was far less formalized than modern states, and a variety of officials' ranks and titles could be found, it is telling that basically every Seljuk court had a Grand Vizier and a Mustafi at the very least, and on occasion, the post of Mustafi appears to have even surpassed the power of the Grand Vizier. Another office that was found in basically all Seljuk courts was the office of Tughra Writer, or Tughrahi. This office was a Seljuk innovation, and one that will continue right down throughout the Ottoman era. This person was a vizier at court responsible for drawing or writing a tughra on official correspondence. A tughra is a traditional Turkish symbol of the sovereign. It is a seal, likely derived from the tamga symbols used to represent clans on the steppes in the days before the coming of Islam, and it may even be ultimately connected to the sigils used by Chinese emperors. It was then carried west by the Turks and ultimately evolved into a highly elaborate signature of the Sultan written in the Arabic script. And under the Ottomans, it will continue to become even more stylized and elaborate, ultimately evolving into an incredibly ornate and highly stylized symbol that you can still see all over the place in Turkey today, though unfortunately, almost nobody in Turkey actually knows its roots or knows how to read it. The Tughra writer would be responsible for placing this symbol on official orders and correspondence of the Sultan, and by doing so, making it official. Thus in time, the writer would come to act as a secretary for communications for the sovereign, and ultimately, as an official overseeing all communication of the court. Now, these were usually the top 3 offices of the state, and under and around them, an array of bureaucrats could be found. But as I've said, we should not imagine the bureaucracy as composed of highly formalized offices and ministries like those of modern states. Instead, this was a web of officials of varying power and overlapping responsibilities, which of course made this an environment ripe for court intrigue. Tellingly, it is clear that often bureaucrats would wear more than one hat. This was of course not very popular with many Grand Viziers, who wanted everyone to be subject to them and wanted a clear hierarchy in the bureaucracy. Nizam ul-Mulk writes in his Siyasetname, "Whenever one officer is given 2 posts or 3 or 5 or 7 by the divan, it is a sign of the incompetence of the vizier and the negligence of the king." But partially, this seeming disorganization, this web of officials with overlapping powers and duties who could hold multiple posts, seems to have been by design. you do get the sense that the Turkish sultans never really fully trusted the coterie of educated Persians and Arabs who made up their bureaucracy. Even Melik Shah, probably the most cooked Seljuk sultan and the one most under the thumb of the vizierate, made sure to keep Tajul Mulk and other rivals to Nizamul Mulk around. And I think that for many Seljuk rulers, who at heart may have been closer to the steppe ways, and who recognized that their steppe barbarian dynasty was not particularly well loved, a powerful and organized bureaucracy might not have been seen as entirely desirable. Critically, the people who made up this bureaucracy were often imported from the east, from Khorasan and Balkh, where the Seljuks had first come to power. Now, these eastern lands are, somewhat ironically, not really the focus of most of the narrative histories that come down to us. In fact, you'll notice that the narrative we covered spent most of its time in Iran, Iraq, Syria, the Caucasus, and Anatolia, not in Khorasan and Balkh. But this bias obscures the fact that these eastern lands were in many ways the real center of the empire. And indeed, it was here where the continuity from the Ghaznavid and Samanid administrative states was the strongest, and indeed where, after the collapse, the institutions of the central Seljuk state would endure for the longest. Think of Nizam-ul-Mulk. He started his career in the service of the Ghaznavids, and then jumped ship to the Seljuks when his homeland was conquered. He was far from the only man to do that, and thus in the east, the administrative state largely continued under new masters. And when the Seljuks conquered west, they brought many bureaucrats from the east with them. The sources note a great deal of tension between the Khorasani bureaucrats from the east and the Western Persian and Arab bureaucrats, with the Westerners feeling distinctly displaced. The education and background of the bureaucrats is also telling. Not only did they mostly come from the east, but they mostly had a classical Perso-Islamic education. Now, this of course meant studying Islamic law and philosophy and the Quran, but this education was far more than just religious. They would have all been fluent in both Arabic and Persian, and studied philosophy, history, literature, and mathematics. Additionally, in order to really advance their career at court, the more ambitious would have grudgingly learned Turkish. For example, the Vizier Kunduri is reported to have acted as a translator for the illiterate Tughro, which means he must have learned Turkish. Mahmud Kashgari, the great Turkish scholar, implored the educated to learn the language of the Turks, for their reign will be long. But in the Seljuk period, Turkish never really attained the status of Arabic or Persian in the eyes of the educated and cultured people of the Muslim world. Indeed, I would argue that even to this day, it has not attained that status. Turkish was of course the language of the army, and was spoken at court, especially by the Sultan and his Emirs and the royal family. In that sense, it was the language of power, but Arabic and Persian were very much the language of the civil state and the religious establishment. A great example of the education of the bureaucrats can be found in the description of a Jewish convert to Islam who rose in the bureaucracy in the later Seljuk period. He wrote that in addition to having knowledge of the Torah and the Talmud that he learned as a young man, he had studied philosophy, likely both Aristotle and the more modern Islamic philosophy, and Islamic law and the Quran, then classical Indian mathematics, and then Islamic medicine that had been developed in the Abbasid period. This was followed by the more modern math developed in the Abbasid period, namely accounting as well as algebra and geometry. Later in life, he delved into the Islamic, Roman, and Greek histories. So really, quite a well-rounded education, especially compared to that of generally illiterate European courtiers of the time, and quite honestly, even Chinese bureaucrats. Another interesting feature, and one that we will see pop up again in the future, is that many, if not most of the bureaucrats seem to have been from relatively modest origins. We have reference to one powerful vizier being mocked for having peasant origins, for example. Even where bureaucrats had noble blood, they were often from noble families who had fallen on hard times. So these bureaucrats were generally not men of means, which made them ideal servants from the sultan's perspective. As we will see again in Anatolia, both with the Seljuk sultans of Rum and the Ottomans, there was often a distinct preference of Turkish sultans to elevate men of lowly birth. Being of lowly birth, these men would not be able to pose a threat to the ruler. A powerful noble, who also had become a powerful vizier, would become very formidable, perhaps even seeing himself as a future sultan. But an impoverished noble, or a slave, or a man with peasant or merchant origins? Such a man would have no base of power outside of the throne itself, and as such was probably going to be more loyal. But as time went on, naturally these men of lowly origins became rich themselves, and they would of course then promote their own sons and relatives into the Seljuk bureaucracy, thus leading, in essence, to dynasties of bureaucrats and officials. And within the state, these bureaucrats became immensely powerful and wealthy. On one level, this undermined the very rationale of appointing men of lowly birth, but on another level, it still meant that no matter how powerful a courtier became, they were still tied to the central state. The central state was still the mechanism by which they exercised power. They might vie for power within the central state, but they weren't going to try to get rid of the state itself or weaken it in comparison to its vassals or the other centers of power. And as a result, it wasn't so much powerful courtiers as powerful emirs who ended up breaking the state apart. Tied to this, a key reason why even powerful viziers and bureaucrat dynasties didn't really challenge state power was in the nature of their compensation. Though junior officials and bureaucrats might be paid salaries in cash, as they rose through the ranks, the officials would start acquiring iktah fiefs as the main source of compensation. And remember, the iktah were tax fiefs granted to a person but that remained in the grant of the state, of the sultan. They could therefore be withdrawn at any time for any reason, and they were also often tied to a particular office. Therefore, no matter how powerful they became, because their power and their wealth derived from the central state itself and was in the grant of the court, a bureaucrat could not really ride off to govern his iktah in person. He had to stay at court, which again kept them in some sense loyal to the central state itself, even if they occasionally rode roughshod over the sultan. The institutions of state were therefore deeply tied to the bureaucratic class and vice versa. Now, the main institution of state, the main building block of the central Seljuk court, was of course the divan. If you'll recall, the divan system came into existence early in Islamic history, and it was, in a sense, a council of state. As I said when I first introduced the institution when we discussed Muawiyah and the emergence of Islam and Islamic state structures, the divan would form the basis of Muslim states until the Ottoman administrative reforms of the late empire. When the Seljuks entered the Islamic world, they adopted the system. In fact, they basically just took over the system that already existed without really making any changes at all. Think of how when he captured Nishapur, the first thing Tughral did was assemble the divan of the prior regime. This sort of set the template, and quickly, divans in the established Perso-Islamic form came to be created. Under the reign of Tughral, the Seljuk bureaucracy came to form around 5 main divans. The chief of these divans was the Divan-i-Allah, which oversaw the other divans, appointing officials and essentially acting as a coordinating committee. Other divans were in charge of taxation and revenue raising, the pay of the soldiers, budgeting and accountancy, the oversight of religious foundations, and provincial administration. In the provinces themselves, local divans would be established to report back to the main divan in the central court. However, we should not imagine this system as being overly formalized in the way that our modern departments or ministries of government are. A sultan might establish a divan that would then go dormant. A divan's functions could be taken over by another divan, and there was always a great deal of overlap of functions in any event. And there was also a great deal of overlap in the responsibilities among the officials, and officials often wore more than one hat and served on more than one divan. And crucially, we should always remember that the function of the central state was actually quite limited. As we will discuss when we get to religion, most of the legal system was in essence administered by the religious establishment, the judges, the qadis. These judges were mostly appointed by the caliphal authorities, though the sultans did have a role in confirming them. But day to day, these judges in the Islamic religious establishment, termed the ulama, weren't really under the sultan's control, and they were really responsible for the application of day-to-day law. Things like commercial disputes, family relations law, enforcement of the law and basic public order, inheritance, and so on. So the ulama essentially functioned like a third branch of government, alongside the civil and military wings. A third branch of government largely outside of the control of the court and the central state. And furthermore, the remit of the central state was not comparable to modern states. Modern states do things like run welfare systems and oversee environmental protection and regulate banks and mandate the dimensions of children's car seats. Really, they touch every aspect of our lives. This was not the case for the central Seljuk state. The function of the central state was, in essence, limited to resource extraction, payment for the army, oversight of the religious institutions and the judiciary in conjunction with the caliph, and managing foreign relations. Even things like the maintenance of roads and walls would usually fall to local communities, with the court maybe stepping in for critical projects. For example, ordering a particularly important fortress to be repaired and then footing the bill. Aside from this relatively limited set of aims, the major function of the central state was in essence to act as a court of appeal. Petitioners, unhappy with some local government, could appeal to the sultan and his court to intervene, which the sultan would occasionally do. So this sort of limited role for the central state did not really require extensive institutions of government or highly formalized and structured ministries like our modern states. And furthermore, it seems from the sources that the Seljuk adoption of these structures of state was not total. In some ways, the Seljuk state, even at its most cooked, never really quite reached the sophistication of its models. For example, the state did not adopt a service found in prior Perso-Islamic states termed the Barid, which was both a postal service and an intelligence service for the state. Essentially spies and official postmen who would keep an eye on things in the provinces and report back to the center. This had existed in the Abbasid Caliphate at its height and under the Samanids and the Ghaznavids and the Buyids as a way to tie the distant corners of the empire together and keep the ruler informed. The authoritative Seljuk historian A.C.S. Peacock suggests that the Seljuk sultans likely did not trust the bureaucratic class of Persians and Arabs who would be doing this work, which itself speaks volumes to the tensions between the Turkish and Persian elements within the state. That said, Nizam-ul-Mulk does say in the Siyaset-Nameh, spies in the costume of traders, travelers, Sufis, medicinalists, and dervishes should be sent out to the four corners of the world, and they should bring news back of what they hear. We should not be ignorant of the circumstances of any country. So there clearly was an intelligence gathering service of a sort, just likely not run by the Arab and Persian courtiers. And that said, even if the sophistication of the Seljuk administration never really matched that of prior dynasties, the state was still quite formidable. And they even did add some new offices to the state, including the office of Tukra writer, as we have discussed. Now this court was of course connected to the Sultan. It was tied to his person. Think of how Alp Arslan spent most of his reign traversing the empire. Well, that meant that the court also moved with him, though not all of the officials would have followed him on campaign or traveled with him constantly, and likely the divans would have just continued on in Esfahan or Rey or wherever. But even when located in a city, in practice the court would often camp outside the city. As befits a nomadic empire, the real home of the court was really the encampment, which the sources call Muasker, or the place of the soldiers. The Seljuk mobile court was a combination of a court, a military encampment, a bazaar, a stable, and even a sports arena, as the sultans loved to hunt and play polo. One Iranian writer describes it as follows: "The sultan's court was a real town, and resounded with 1,000 noises, the neighing of Arab horses, the jingling of the gilded trappings, the call of the servants and the Mamelukes, the cry of the haughty gatekeepers, the repeated drumming of the nauba, the gallop of horses brought for the race." This encampment could be quite large, up to 2 farsangs a side, which would be about 12 kilometers a side. At its center would sit the tents of the sultan, traditionally red. Spread out from there would be the tents of other officials, the soldiers, the stables, and so on. So really, this court was a moving city. Now, that does not mean that all sultans always stayed in these encampments. Melik Shah, for example, seems to have spent most of his time in palaces in Esfahan and in Baghdad. And at the same time, important cities like Esfahan, Rey, and Nishapur all acted like capitals in a sense, housing divans, bureaucrats, and mints and treasuries and record-keeping houses. Additionally, this entire mobile city would not necessarily follow the sultan when he went on military campaign. When Alparslan marched into the Caucasus, for example, perhaps some courtiers would come with him, some would stay in Esfahan, some would perhaps go as far as Tabriz or something like that. The important thing to note is that power moved with the sultan. The capital was, in a sense, wherever he was. Therefore, much of the time, Seljuk court life and thus power of the central state really was located in these semi-public military encampments. This clearly is a practice that ties back to the steppe life, and not the life of a sedentary shah. So that was the nature of the central court and the central state. But we should not imagine that this central state was all-powerful. Indeed, far from it. Most importantly, there was not just one court. It wasn't just the sultan on the top who had a court along the lines of what we just discussed, with divans and viziers and tughra writers and so on. There were the other courts of the Seljuk state. Think of the line of Kavurts ruling in Kirman or the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. And these courts were all built on the model we just discussed. In essence, reproductions of this same court structure further down the chain. And all of these other Seljuk courts, of course, had power in the lands they ruled. Remember, the Seljuk Empire was very much a Turkish state, and think back to the other Turkish states we covered, like the First and Second Turkish Khanates, the Turgesh, the Karakhanids, and the Oghuz Yabgu state. All of these states were divided, mostly into classic Turkish east-west and left-right divisions. Now, of course, this was also true of the Seljuks. If you'll recall in the beginning, Chahri took the senior east and Tughral took the junior west, as was traditional in the steppe world they came from. Well, that idea, the idea of multiple courts, continued, and as we covered in the narrative, a bunch of Seljuk courts arose. Indeed, as we said earlier, it was tied to the Turkish concept of clan sovereignty. The state belonged to the ruling clan, any member of which could inherit, and which could be divided among the members of the clan, albeit with one supreme sultan on the top. All of these courts would then exist in conjunction with each other, with power and authority oscillating around them. And the relationship between these other courts and the central court was of course very ambiguous. It was under constant negotiation, which, as we saw in the narrative, could often spill over into actual war, as in the case of Kavurt and Ibrahim Yanal and Suleiman. And if you'll recall, these wars would often result in the offender being forgiven. Essentially, through the battle, God had decided who was supposed to win, and everyone would then accept their place in the newly affirmed or perhaps renegotiated hierarchy and get on with it. In essence, the legitimacy of the rule of these other courts was baked into the system, and was part and parcel of clan sovereignty. That's why Nizam-ul-Mulk's decision to kill Kavurt was seen as an outrage by the Turkmen. It was contrary to the Turkish practices and their very idea of how the state worked. And aside from these other courts, there were other centers of power. Remember, there were countless other vassals who remained in power but now recognized the sovereignty of the Seljuk Sultan. Think of the Emirs of Aleppo or of Mosul, or of the Karakhanids. As we covered in the narrative, they all submitted, but they remained very much running their own shows. Now, depending on the vassal, there would be varying levels of interference in their affairs by the Seljuk court. In general, the smaller the vassal, the more the interference. The Karakhanid Khan had far more leeway in directing his khanate than the Emir of Derbend. There were also, as we have discussed before, the tribes themselves and the Turkmen confederations like the Nawakiya. These tribes existed alongside the more formal polities, but unfortunately we just don't have great written sources. However, the sources do frequently mention the Turkmen roaming the countryside, grazing their herds throughout the lands. As we discussed in the narrative, the tribes were above all concerned with pasturage, and they therefore gravitated to those parts of the empire most ecologically suited to grazing herds. These were the belt of pasturage between Hamadan and Rey in Iran, the Caucasus, in particular Azerbaijan, Khorasan in the east, northern Syria and Iraq, and of course Anatolia. In these areas, the tribes continued to live the traditional steppe lifestyle, and continue to have all of the trappings of Turkish political structure we've seen throughout this podcast. A clan-based tribal society based on the nomadic husbandry of the 5 species of Eurasian grazing mammals. But the top level of these tribes and clans, of course, interfaced with the Seljuk state. And of course, we saw the formation of tribal confederations in loose alliance with the ever-cooking court, most importantly the Nawakiya, whose complex relationship with the court we have already discussed in detail. But it bears repeating that for all the Seljuk sultans became more and more Persian, they remained Turkish rulers at heart, and their relationship with the tribes was absolutely crucial. Unfortunately, because the tribes themselves didn't really leave us any written sources, our knowledge of their political organization is extremely limited. In the narrative, we covered the rise of the Nawakiya, how a distinct tribal confederation formed around princes of the House of Seljuk and other major Turkish aristocrats. They then interfaced directly with the Seljuk state, but in a relationship of constant negotiation and indeed tension. And while the Nawakiya were the most important of these confederations, they were not the only one. We should imagine a plethora of tribal groups and confederations of varying sizes, led by different aristocratic lineages, and with varying relations to the Seljuk court and the Seljuk dynasty. All of this would have been incredibly fluid and under constant negotiation, even if our Arab and Persian authors are largely silent on the matter. However, while we do not have great written evidence, we do have some interesting archaeological evidence. On the plains of Iran, in the land between Rey and Hamadan, where the Turkmen grazed their herds, there stand 2 massive mausoleums far away from any settlement. They were constructed by powerful Turkmen chieftains during the Seljuk era, one constructed during the reign of Alp Arslan, one shortly after the death of Melik Shah. In the absence of written sources written on their behalf, these massive tombs do suggest that the Turkmen chieftains remained wealthy, powerful, and critical to the state. And even the written sources, which again always try to diminish the importance of the Turks to the state because of the perspective of their authors, do show this obliquely. The Sultan would routinely present himself to his nomadic subjects as part of fulfilling his role as a steppe warlord. He would perform the traditional Turkish ceremonies expected by the tribes. Successful sultans would always remember to fulfill their obligation as steppe warlords, to provide pasturage and plunder. But we should always remember that the actual control of the sultan over the tribes was in fact very loose, and the tribes themselves thus represented another center of power in the state separate from the court, and we have seen the consequences of that in the narrative over and over and over again. Separately, there was Baghdad and the central lands of Iraq, where the caliph continued to run the show, albeit in concert with the sultan. Here the lines between the power of the caliph his viziers, his Turkish Mameluke slave army, and the Seljuk messengers and officials was always quite blurry. Again, it was a matter of constant negotiation between the Caliph and the Sultan, or Nizam ul-Mulk. Now, I'm going to get into far more detail about this complex relationship when we cover religion, but we should remember that it also had a temporal component with respect to Baghdad itself. The Caliph was more than an emir, of course, but in some sense, he was also the emir of Baghdad and central Iraq. Here, he continued to hold some sort of temporal power, and after the civil war following the death of Melik Shah, an actual caliphal state would re-emerge. But in addition to the other Seljuk courts, the separate vassals of the empire, the tribes, and the special case of the caliph, throughout the empire everywhere, there were other competing centers of power and other levels of power. Remember that the Seljuk state was in essence a hodgepodge, built over time by the Seljuks taking over the institutions of their predecessors and layering new institutions atop other institutions. Tuhrul had negotiated his way into power, largely leaving the traditional institutions of the Muslim world intact, with the Seljuk state in essence slotting in above them. This traditional political system that predated the Seljuks was largely built around the cities as the primary political units, the building blocks of the political world. Cities would come under one emirate or another, or they could be directly ruled by the court in a sense, but always they were the essential locus of government on a day-to-day level. And these cities and the local nobility and their institutions were still there. They just now existed under the new layers of political control put in above them. And over time, these pre-existing political institutions came to be joined by the officials of the central state, or the other Seljuk courts, or crucially, the new Emirs. Now, the Emirs were again a mixed bunch. The title was quite widely used among the military establishment, as we will discuss next episode. Some emirs served the Sultan at court, overseeing the central military establishment. Some were wandering emirs, traveling the vast empire and joining up with other Seljuk courts or vassals. But most critically of all, there were emirs who were in essence landed gentry. These emirs came into their own during al-Dawla al-Nizamiyya, and they were in essence military commanders who were given an iktaf fief that they then rode off to govern. Unlike the bureaucrats, who were essentially absentee landlords, the emirs would often decamp to their fiefs. There they would rule as local nobles, administering the cities or towns attached to the fief. In essence, acting as the guy on top, with the power to oversee the traditional urban elites and the political structures of the cities. And as we have discussed, given the ability of a court to withdraw an iktaf fief, the holder was incentivized to extract maximum value from it in the present. This often led to mismanagement, and it could also lead to complaints. We have records of local elites complaining to the Sultan that an iktaf holder was abusing his position and acting arbitrarily. And this is a good segue into the relationship between the central court and this hodgepodge of lower courts, tribes, cities, local elites, vassal emirs, vassal khans, and vassal sultanates. Essentially, in order to manage this bewildering array of political structures and the relationships therewith, a vast army of officials was sent out from the central court. The first stage of this occurred during Tuhrul's reign, when the court sent out agents to the newly submitted Iranian lords and cities. These agents, termed nuwab in Arabic, acted like a combination of ambassador and tax collector. Their purpose was both to manage communication between the subject lord and the court, and to extract the tribute that had been agreed upon when the cities had submitted. Crucially, they did not really have an administrative function. Their purpose was communication and resource extraction. But as the state became more cooked, a greater number of officials were sent out with a wider remit of authority. The Seljuk court would send out both civil and military officials to the provinces in an attempt to exert control over the lower-level political structures. In his Siyaset-Nameh, Nizam ul-Mulk mentions in passing that each city should have at least a tax official called an amil, a cadi, a military official, and a civil official. The military officials were emirs, who were usually called shihna, atabe, or melik, and the civil officials were called wali, meaning governor. Other officials would be sent out lower down the totem pole and would report to the shihna or the wali or even the ulama of a given region. However, in a state as decentralized and messy as the Seljuk Empire, the actual day-to-day power and authority of any of these officials varied greatly across time and space. In some times and in some places, they were essentially representatives of the court and nothing more. In others, they actually ran the region with an iron fist. So the picture we should have of the Seljuk state is of a highly fragmented and decentralized polity, an empire that at its height governed a truly vast territory. Speaking in terms of modern borders, a state stretching from what is now China to Turkey, from Georgia to Pakistan, from Kazakhstan to Yemen. But though it was massive, the empire itself was in fact quite fractious and diffuse. The central Seljuk court was not able to, and did not even aspire to, create a uniform and centralized state. The central Seljuk court always wanted to increase its influence and power, but so did the other Seljuk courts, the emirs, the tribes, and even the officials and the bureaucrats. And all parties working within this system recognized that total power was not actually attainable. It's not just that the central Seljuk court did not have total power over the empire, it's that the court did not even aspire to have that power. Indeed, the state was in essence a project of constant negotiation among these parties, among these power centers. The sultan, the bureaucracy, the tribes, the emirs, the caliph, the vassals, the officials, and so on. It was a multicentric, multipolar project, a massive web of people and institutions, and it was extremely fluid. Nothing was either fixed or highly formalized. Tied to this, it is quite clear that the Seljuk state did not have the idea of monopoly over the use of legitimate force. This is sort of the key definition of a state in the modern world. On some level, what we mean when we say a state is basically the entity that exercises a monopoly over legitimate violence within a given territory. But the Seljuk state didn't really have that. Any of the courts, emirs, bureaucrats, vassals, and so on was totally legitimate in raising and commanding troops. Indeed, in using violence for its own ends. Any of these power centers could, and indeed often did, raise up an army to enforce its claims and get an upper hand in the constant negotiation process that characterized Seljuk power. And crucially, this was seen as totally legitimate. Again, this might in some way be connected to the Turkish political concept of clan sovereignty, the way that Turkish states in general were fine with dividing and sharing rule, and fine with everyone using force to advance their claims. Which is a good place to end today, because next time, we're going to discuss how violence worked in the Great Seljuk Empire as we dive into the Seljuk army, or rather, the Seljuk armies.